Next up, let's talk about the Bootstrap Navbar and how we can use it to responsively to create both desktop and mobile navbars. The Bootstrap Navbar is responsive out of the box. It includes support for branding, for navigation, and a whole lot more. It also includes support for the collapse plugin, which we can use to show and hide items as we need to. Navbar requires the Navbar class as the outer element in combination with one of the Navbar expand breakpoint responsive classes. You also need to add a color scheme class to specify should it be dark or light. And then navbars and their contents are fluid by default, meaning that they will dynamically scale to any size screen. Navbars are responsive by default. If you want them to not be responsive, that's actually behavior you have to turn off. So it's turned off. The responsive behavior is turned on by default. Also out of the box, navbars are hidden when printing, which is great because usually when you're printing out a page, you don't want to see the navbar. I don't care about the navbar if I'm making a printout of your page. You can use all of the spacing and variety of flex utility classes to control the spacing and the alignment with your navbars. So you have quite a lot of tools in your bag to control how they look. So let's look at a very simple navbar. And in this case specifically will not be responsive because I'm going to turn the responsive behavior off and say that this should be how it displays on all screen sizes. So looking at the top at the root, you'll notice that this is first of all, it's a nav tag. And remember to do that because this is a navigation area. Okay. So there I have, first class is the navbar. Remember, I need that to start my navbar. I've given it the class navbar expand. Now that navbar expand, notice that it doesn't have a breakpoint, which means that the navbar will always be expanded because I haven't told it to what breakpoint to expand at. It's going to expand at even the smallest screens. Okay, so that's the part that tells it to not be responsive. Is navbar expand. Navbar dark then tells it that this is a dark colored navbar, which hints that it probably is going to be a dark background. But what navbar dark does, it doesn't actually change the background color. What it does is it changes the text color to go along with that background color. So navbar dark, contrary to what it might seem, actually what it does is it makes the text white. It doesn't make the background dark, it makes the text light. So then I also need to add background dark to actually make the navbar a dark color. So that's the outer level and those things I configure. So you're going to start with navbar. What breakpoint do you want to expand? Should it be light or dark? And what color should the background be? Inside of there, I've got the navbar brand, which is usually where we're going to put the logo and the name of the company. So that's what we have here. Okay. And then to the right of that, we have the navbar nav. Now notice the navbar nav is an unordered list. Okay, so we have an unordered list, and that represents all of the items actually in the navbar. Okay. Inside of that, we have a variety of list items. Each of those represent an item in the navbar. Those are labeled with the class nav item, and the active one is labeled with the class active. So you can see that home is appearing a slightly different color. That's because it has been marked with active and the other ones have not. So that is the active page. And then inside of there, you see we finally have the actual links to the different pages, and those are marked with the class of navlink. So we have a nav, we have a UL with navbar nav, we have an LI, which is a nav item, and then finally we have a nav link, an anchor tag, which is a nav link. And that's the process that you see following on down further. So now let's look at how to actually make the navbar responsive. The first and most important thing I need to do is change the navbar rather for the navbar expand, which is not responsive, I need to change it to navbar expand SM. And this will tell it to So now that we've talked about how to build a basic navbar, which isn't responsive, let's talk about how to make a navbar responsive. So to make a navbar responsive, the big change that I need to do first is to change the navbar expand to have a breakpoint. And at that breakpoint is where it's actually going to expand, and you're going to see all the links. So at that breakpoint, smaller or larger, it's going to look like this. But below that breakpoint, below small, it's going to collapse, and all the items will go into the hamburger menu that you see over on the right. Okay. So we have that. We have when it's collapsed, they're all the items go into that hamburger. You click the hamburger and it expands, and now you see all the items arranged vertically, which is better on mobile. So the first thing we need to do is make that conversion is, again, to specify where the breakpoint is. So in here, I've specified that the breakpoint is at small. That's one that you really play. You have to test it and see where does it need to be based on the number of links that you have in there. So the more links you have, the sooner it's going to need to break. The fewer links you have, the later it can break. So here I don't have a whole lot of links, and they're relatively small, relatively short, meaning I can break at small. But if I had a lot more links in my navbar, then this might actually break at large. It might break at large or medium, because at that point I stop having enough space. So this can be anywhere from, you can expand SM, medium, large, depending on what makes sense for your particular navbar. Also, the other thing I have to do is I have to actually add this hamburger in. So this hamburger goes in here between the brand and the navbar nav area. I need to give it a class of navbar toggler, and then I need to add a bunch of other properties to this. This is usually something, honestly, I end up usually having to copy and paste this toggler because there just are so many different properties to add. So it is a button. So we do want to give it a type of button, because remember, by default, buttons are submit buttons. So I need to tell it that just a programmable button. I'm going to then apply these data toggle and data target properties. You may remember from talking about HTML that anything that in HTML, any attribute that starts with data dash is a custom property. It's a way to add data. It's attributes that are not part of the HTML spec. So this data toggle and data target, these are all both properties that have been introduced or are being used by Bootstrap to implement the collapsing logic. So data toggle says we want to toggle the collapse class on the thing we're targeting. So data toggle says we want to toggle the collapse class on and off. Data target then gives us the selector for the thing that we want to toggle. So in here we're saying I want to target the element with the ID of navbar, navbar1. So that's what the target is linked to down here. And you'll also notice that initially the navbar is collapsed, and that's why we have the collapse class here. Initially, when the page loads, the navbar will be collapsed if it's on mobile. So that's why we need to mark it collapse. ARIA controls. Remember, anything that starts with ARIA has to do with screen readers. So for screen readers, we need to tell it what this button does, because they don't inherently know what our button is doing. So we need to tell that this button controls the visibility of the navbar items. So we're going to say controls navbar1. We're going to say initially, is it expanded, yes or no? By default, it's not expanded. By default, it's collapsed. So ARIA expanded is false. And then we've got the ARIA label, which is toggle navigation. So toggle navigation is what the screen reader will actually read. and it will use these other two things to determine if it's expanded, and if it is expanded, what should be expanded and unexpanded, what should it read and not read based on it being expanded or not. And then finally, inside of that button, because remember, buttons are not empty tags, we actually have some content. So we have a span in here with the class of navbar toggler icon. That navbar toggler icon class is what actually creates the hamburger icon. If you don't have that in there, you'll just have a button that doesn't have any content in it. It won't actually have the toggler icon. Okay, so we have to set all of that up just to get the button. And again, I find that's usually easiest to just copy paste from the documentation. Then finally, we had the navbar nav, and when we did it responsively, we didn't have to put it in a container. We just kind of used it directly. But if we want this to be responsive, we need to add another div here. So here we have a div. It has an ID of navbar1. That ID can be really anything you want it to be. Here we've set it to navbar1 and the target, the ARIA controls, and the ID. Remember to keep all three of those in sync. But it doesn't have to have that ID of navbar1. It could be just navbar as your ID. Classes it needs to have is collapse and navbar collapse. Both of those classes together are needed to signal that this is the area that A, it's initially collapsed, and B, this is the area that is collapsed and expanded as part of the navbar. So let's say we want to, a common thing we might want to do is then maybe add a logo. Add a logo to our brand. So one way I could do that, there's a whole lot of ways to do that. I could say, let's add an image. Let's add an image tag. And we'll put that inside of the navbar brand link. Now, typically with the navbar brand link, that should point back to the home page, which is what you can see here. It's pointing back to index.html. So anytime you have that brand, it should have that link back to the home page. Here, you'll see I have the logo and the text next to it. So I'm putting that logo in an image tag, but I also want to then add the actual text into a span. And having those that way makes it possible for us to then turn this navbar brand into a flexbox and align them nicely. If I don't put that span in there, then I don't get the flexbox ability to align the text and the icon. So let's look at some of the CSS that we need to add. We've got navbar brand. We already had that. I'm adding dflex to make this into a flexbox, and remember, by default, a flexbox is horizontal, which is, we're getting a row here, and that's what we want. I'm also telling it to align items center. So remember, align items is on the cross axis, which in this case would be vertical. And I'm telling it to center, which is going to put these two items next to each other and centered. Remember, by default, the align items is set to stretch. And because it's set to stretch by default, they don't actually get aligned. The text would be down at the bottom of the navbar by default. Also notice that I can't use align items baseline, because baseline only works when you're aligning two items that are text. But in this case, because I have an image and text, I need to use center. So that's why I'm using align item center, to align them both vertically. And then in here, for the image, I'm giving it the inline block. So that will change the image to an inline block element. Remember, that's kind of like, it behaves like an inline, but also like a block, at least on the outside or inside in both cases. And then I've got MR2. Remember, margin right 2. And that's creating a little bit of space between the image and the text of the text. If I didn't have that MR2, then the image and the company name would be directly butting up against each other. So you typically need a little bit of margin between those two. You'll also notice that I specified the width and the height properties for this logo. That's going to ensure that the logo isn't huge and it has a constant size. It's especially important too in the navbar, because remember the navbar is up at the top. So if the size of the image changes on load, which it would if I didn't set the width and height, then your entire page layout could potentially change. So by setting the width and height to fixed numbers, I prevent the page from changing drastically when the image loads in, the logo loads in. I'm giving this image an alt of blank, and that's because I immediately have the name of the company afterwards. If you didn't have the name of the company afterwards, you just had the image, then you definitely want to have an alt, or at least mark this as SR only, so that screen readers can have one of those two things to be able to read the company name, either the alt or the span here with the text. I can also use a variety of different color schemes with a few different color schemes with my navbar. So for instance, we looked at navbar dark. Navbar dark, remember, makes the text white. I can also set it to navbar light, which will make the text dark, right? So I use navbar light if I'm going to have a primarily light colored navbar. I use dark if it's a primarily dark colored navbar. So navbar light plus changing the background color. So here I've changed it to light and a background color of light. Now I can mix in any background color I want. I just need to use a contrasting either navbar dark or navbar light, depending on if that navbar goes better with white text or black text. So you'll see in this example I have a dark background, a light background, and a primary colored background. In the primary, at least with this blue, I find that white works better, so I'm going to set this to navbar dark. If I have this one, it's navbar light, because it's a light colored background, and then navbar dark. So navbar dark, navbar light, navbar dark. Okay. You can find a lot more examples of how to work with navbars out at the navbar documentation page on Bootstrap. I'll see you again in the next video.